All right, let's dive in. These readings you gave us on, like, argumentation, especially Schopenhauer's The Art of Being, right? It really seems like you're not just interested in winning arguments, but, like, the tactics people use to seem right even when they're not.
Right.
And then on top of that, we've got Olavo de Carvalho's commentary on Schopenhauer in the books, too. This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating area and kind of paradoxical, too. You know, Schopenhauer called this type of argumentation eristic dialectic.
Right.
And he seemed to really, really dislike it.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading through it.
Yeah.
He even said at one point that studying this stuff made him, like, nauseous.
I know.
But then he writes a whole book on it.
I know.
So what's going on with that?
Well, there's some scholars who think it was partly due to his rivalry with Hegel, who was another philosopher.
Okay.
And Schopenhauer believed that Hegel was using these very tactics in his arguments. And so he may have wanted to kind of expose them so that people wouldn't be fooled.
Oh, so it was like intellectual warfare.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's like, intellectual combat. Using these like sneaky tactics.
Right.
What's also really interesting is that he never intended to publish this work.
No, really?
Yeah, he saw it as like this kind of dark art, you know? Something to understand for self-defense,
Right.
but not to use for personal gain.
Which makes total sense if you think about, like, why you wanted us to deep dive into this. You want to be able to understand these tactics so you can avoid being manipulated. Right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like you're learning the rules of this game that everyone's playing, but you didn't even know existed and maybe losing.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm, like, really curious.
Yeah.
What are some of these, like, sneaky tricks that Schopenhauer's talking about?
Well, he lays out 38 different stratagems, and some of them are just like incredibly sneaky. For example, he talks about something called homonymia subtil,
Okay.
which Carvalho explains as using the different meanings of a word to twist an argument.
Yeah.
And the example that he gives is how the word honor was often distorted to justify duels back in the day.
That's pretty devious.
Yeah.
But, I mean, honestly, I can see that happening all the time, even today, especially when you have these arguments that get really emotionally charged.
Absolutely. And another one that's particularly relevant to, like, today's world is pre-syllogismos, which basically means using hidden assumptions to manipulate the argument.
Okay.
So it's like you're slipping in this premise that sounds really innocent,
Right.
but it's actually shaping the whole debate.
That sounds a lot like what we see in politics, right?
Yes.
Where, like, politicians try to control the narrative by framing the issues in a certain way that benefits them.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was way ahead of his time in recognizing how language can be used as this tool of manipulation.
Okay, so I'm starting to see, like, why this is so important, but isn't this all a bit, like, cynical? Are you saying that, like, every argument is just this power struggle?
Well, not necessarily, but it's really important to be aware of these tactics so you can recognize them when they're being used. And, you know, remember, Schopenhauer's goal wasn't to teach people how to be manipulative.
Okay.
It was to help them avoid being manipulated themselves.
Okay, so it's more about, like, self-defense than anything else.
Exactly. It's about being a more discerning listener and a more, like, critical thinker. It's about being able to see through the smoke and mirrors and get to the heart of what's actually being said.
Okay, I'm on board with that.
Okay.
But let's get back to, like, the actual tactics. What are some other examples of these stratagems?
So another one that Schopenhauer calls out is encolorizar o adversario, which basically means enraging the opponent.
Okay.
So it's about, like, using insults or personal attacks to make your opponent lose their cool.
Oh, that's classic. I've definitely seen that one
Oh, yeah, for sure.
in action. See, it seems like some people just want to, like, push your buttons so you can't think straight.
Exactly. And when you're emotionally charged, you're more likely to make mistakes in your reasoning. Carvalho even mentions how this tactic was common among certain intellectuals in Brazil who were known for their, like, really quick wit and how they would use that to fluster their opponents.
It makes me wonder if that's, like, why some people are so drawn to online debates where, like, they can kind of hide behind their screens and say whatever they want without having to deal with, like, the consequences.
It's a really interesting point, yeah. It seems like the anonymity of the internet can make people more prone to these types of tactics.
Okay, so we've covered a few of Schopenhauer's 38 stratagems.
Right.
What else stands out to you?
Well, another one that Schopenhauer warns against is argumento ad auditors, which means like using arguments that sound impressive to an audience, even if they're logically flawed.
Oh, that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
As someone who, really values being well-informed, how can I spot that kind of manipulation?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. So don't be swayed by fancy language or appeals to like popular opinion.
Okay.
Really ask yourself, does the argument actually hold up under scrutiny? Is there actual evidence to support it?
Yeah.
And are there any like hidden assumptions or biases at play?
That's good advice. It seems like this whole topic is really about like becoming more aware of the subtle ways that language can be used to manipulate us, both in arguments and just like in everyday life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think Carvalho makes a really interesting point about this when he talks about the power of what he calls like poetic imagery in persuasion.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Tell me more about that.
So Carvalho is highlighting that arguments aren't just about logic.
Right.
They also tap into our emotions and imagination. And he argues that there's this like poetic dimension to language that can be incredibly persuasive, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
So it's like there's this whole like hidden layer to communication that goes beyond the actual words themselves.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so powerful.
Exactly. And understanding that hidden layer can completely change how you view the world around you. It can help you see through the manipulation and get to the heart of what's really being said.
This is making me think about all those times I've been swayed by like a really clever argument or a really catchy slogan.
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize how easily we can be manipulated if we're not careful.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics.
Okay, so we've talked about how Schopenhauer and Carvalho view these like manipulative tactics.
Right.
But what about like their views on finding truth? Do they have any advice on like how to actually have productive, meaningful conversations?
That's a great question, and it leads us to a really fascinating aspect of their work.
Right.
Both Schopenhauer and Carvalho seem to suggest that there's this like deeper level of understanding that goes beyond like winning arguments, that truth might be found not in the heat of debate, but in something else entirely.
So like instead of just trying to win, maybe the goal should be something completely different when we're having these discussions. Like what were they suggesting as an alternative?
Well, Carvalho describes this process where you kind of go inward and you're carefully observing what he calls the words of a text supremely self-evident, inscribed in your own consciousness.
That sounds deep. Like are we talking about like meditation here?
It's similar. It's about quieting all that like mental chatter and really tuning into your inner voice.
Right.
And then he says the challenge is like translating that inner truth into words without distorting it.
Yeah.
Which is really hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's hard enough just figuring out what you actually think about something, let alone explaining it perfectly to someone else.
Right, exactly. And Schopenhauer points out how like a really skilled debater, especially someone with bad intentions, will try to pull you away from that inner clarity. They'll nitpick like insignificant details, or they'll throw out these ridiculous objections just to kind of get you riled up and distract you from the main point.
So it's like they're trying to drag you down into the mud with them.
Yes, exactly. They know that the more you get caught up in defending these like little side points, the further you move away from that place of like genuine understanding.
This is making me think about how I approach like disagreements in my own life. I wonder how often I fall into those traps without even realizing it.
Yeah, it's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Right.
And maybe, as Carvalho suggests, sometimes it's actually better to just preserve that inner truth in silence rather than risk having it warped or misunderstood in the middle of a heated argument.
That makes sense to me. But then wouldn't that mean that sometimes truth gets silenced? Especially when, like, the loudest voices in the room are the ones who are being manipulative or dishonest.
That's a very real concern. And it brings up this really important point about knowing when to engage in an argument and when to step back.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer seems to be saying that if you're not really grounded in your own understanding,
Right.
then getting into those types of debates can actually be harmful.
Because you could lose sight of your own truth in the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in a way, you're also giving power to those people who are more interested in winning
Right.
than in actually finding the truth.
Okay, so how do we navigate this? How do we engage in these like meaningful discussions without falling prey to all of these like sneaky tactics?
Well, I think the first step is recognizing those tactics when they're being used, which is where Schopenhauer's work is so helpful. And then it's about cultivating that inner clarity, that connection to your own truth,
Right.
so that you're not so easily swayed by those external pressures.
It sounds like a lifelong process.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a practice that's becoming even more important in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with
right,
information and opinions from all sides.
So instead of trying to like win every argument, we can try to approach these conversations in a different way.
I think that's a really powerful insight. And maybe, like Schopenhauer and Carvalho suggest, sometimes the most profound truths are found not in the chaos of debate, but in the stillness of introspection.
That's definitely something to think about. So if Schopenhauer was so against this whole eristic dialectic thing, what did he think was the right way to approach argumentation?
Well, he didn't offer like a specific set of rules or guidelines like he did with the 38 stratagems, but I think we can get a sense of his ideal from the way he critiques those manipulative tactics.
So it's like we can learn from the negative example.
Exactly. By understanding what not to do, we can start to piece together what a more like honest and productive approach to argumentation might look like.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What have you gleaned from his critiques?
Right.
Like, what did Schopenhauer think an ideal argument should look like?
Well, one thing that really stands out is his emphasis on like clarity and precision in language.
Okay.
He constantly criticizes those who use vague terms or shift definitions or try to hide behind fancy rhetoric to obscure their true meaning.
That makes sense. If you're really seeking truth, then you should be able to express your ideas clearly and directly, right?
Exactly. Schopenhauer believed that like clear thinking leads to clear communication. And conversely, that muddled thinking often hides behind all that obfuscation and wordplay.
So no more hiding behind jargon or using 10 words when one will do?
Right. He would probably advocate for like simple, straightforward language that is accessible to everyone, not just academics or intellectuals.
I can get behind that.
Yeah. Another key principle that kind of emerges from his critique is the importance of like intellectual honesty.
What does that mean in the context of like an argument?
It means being willing to acknowledge the weaknesses in your own position, to consider opposing viewpoints fairly, and to prioritize like truth over winning at all costs.
So it's about like having the humility to admit when you're wrong or when you don't know something.
Precisely. Schopenhauer would probably argue that a genuine pursuit of truth requires a certain amount of self-doubt and a willingness to change your mind when presented with new evidence.
That's a refreshing perspective, especially in today's world where people seem so entrenched in their own beliefs.
It is, and it highlights a key difference between eristic dialectic and what we might call a more dialectical approach to argumentation. What's the difference? So eristic dialectic is all about victory, about using any means necessary to come out on top. It's adversarial and often manipulative.
Right, and we've seen plenty of examples of that today.
Exactly. But a true dialectical approach, as Schopenhauer seems to envision it, is more about like collaboration. It's about two or more people working together to arrive at a deeper understanding of a topic, even if they disagree on certain points.
So it's about using argumentation as a tool for like shared exploration and discovery.
Exactly. And it's a process that requires respect, empathy, and a genuine desire to learn from each other.
That sounds a lot more appealing than the kind of like mudslinging we often see in debates today.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the challenge Schopenhauer is leaving us with, to find a way to engage in arguments that are both intellectually rigorous and ethically sound.
So how do we actually like put this into practice? How do we shift from that win at all costs mentality to a more collaborative approach?
Well, I think it starts with cultivating certain qualities within ourselves. So it's not just about like learning the rules of logic or studying philosophy. It's about actually like changing the way we approach conversations.
I think that's a big part of it, yeah. Cultivating like intellectual humility.
Right.
Being willing to admit when we're wrong and genuinely listening to what others have to say.
That can be tough, though, especially when you feel really strongly about something.
It is, but I think Schopenhauer would argue that it's essential if we want to have like meaningful conversations and move closer to the truth.
Okay, so intellectual humility is important.
What else?
Another key quality is curiosity.
Okay.
Instead of approaching conversations with the goal of like proving our point, what if we approach them with a genuine desire to learn something new?
That's a good point. I know when I'm really curious about something, I'm much more open to hearing different perspectives,
Yeah.
even if they challenge my own views.
Exactly. Curiosity helps us to like step outside of our own limited perspectives and see the world through different eyes.
This is all making me think back to like Carvalho's point about the poetic dimension of language. If we're trying to have more productive conversations, maybe we need to be more mindful of how we're using language.
Yeah.
Not just the words themselves, but also like the emotions and images they evoke.
That's a really insightful connection, yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps instead of using language to like manipulate or control, we can use it to connect, to build bridges of understanding.
It's like choosing to wield those tools for good instead of bad.
Yes. Exactly. And remember, Schopenhauer was deeply skeptical of this whole eristic dialectic thing. He saw it as a distraction from the real pursuit of truth.
Which, if we're being honest, takes a lot more effort than just trying to win an argument.
It does. It requires intellectual humility, a willingness to question our own assumptions, and a genuine desire to understand perspectives that are different from our own.
And maybe a little bit of that silence and introspection that Carvalho talked about.
Yeah.
Taking the time to reflect on our own beliefs.
Yeah.
And to really listen to what others are saying.
Perhaps that's where it all begins. By quieting the inner noise, we create space for something more meaningful to emerge.
Well, I think you've given our listener a lot to think about today. It's been a deep dive in every sense of the word.
It has.
We've explored the dark side of argumentation. But we've also uncovered some really valuable insights about how to have more honest, productive, and maybe even transformative conversations.
It's been a fascinating journey. And as we wrap up, I'm curious, what's resonating most with you after exploring all of this?
I think what stands out to me most is this idea that the most persuasive arguments aren't necessarily the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes the quietest voice, the one that speaks from a place of genuine understanding and humility, can have the most impact.
That's a beautiful insight. And maybe that's the challenge Schopenhauer and Carvalho are leaving us with, to cultivate that inner strength and clarity so that when we do choose to speak, our words carry the weight of truth, not just the desire to win.
So maybe instead of trying to win that next debate, you'll choose to engage differently. And if you do find yourself facing one of Schopenhauer's 38 stratagems, you'll know exactly what's going on. You might even be able to have a little fun with it.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking that inner truth that guides you to a deeper understanding of the world.
Yes.
And yourself